Hi class. So today's lecture on fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. This is pretty complicated, but then again, it depends how you look at that. So fluid compartments. We need to know that the water moves from one compartment into another compartment, and there's a proper ratio, the proper ratio that your body must maintain. So there's intravascular space, there's interstitial space, and there's intracellular space. So we can look at the different types of abbreviations. Interstitial fluid, that's interstitial fluid that is between cells and blood vessels. The volume about 15 liters, so that's about 20% of the body weight. And then there's plasma in blood, extracellular fluid, right? So, or you can look at that as intravascular fluid that is part of the extracellular fluid because it's outside of the cell compartment. So interstitial fluid and intravascular fluid are both extracellular fluid. And then intracellular fluid, that's inside of the cell. So intracellular fluid is about 40% of the body weight. So the extracellular fluid is 20%, and the 20% includes plasma 20% and 80% of interstitial fluid. So it's basically, if you take extracellular fluid, so the blood will be about 20% and interstitial fluid would be 80%, and this equals to 20% of the entire total body water. And the intracellular fluid, right, intracellular fluid equals to 40% of the total body weight. So the 20 plus this 40 gives us 60% of the body fluid in the system. As far as the percentages, it's great to know them approximately. I try to remember them like 1/3 or 1/2 or 1/4 rather than just the percentages. It depends how you want to memorize them. And between genders, males and females, fluid fluctuates. Males are about 60% of water and females are about 50% of water. So there's also other fluctuations. Why with the females? Higher fat content, less skeletal muscles. Adipose tissue as least hydrated of all. The thing is that there's water that needs to support muscle mass, so that's why when there's less muscle mass, there's less water. So the ratio is about 1:3. So if you have 1 gram of muscle, you need about 3 grams of water to support the muscle mass. So that's why with females, when you see it less, it's just because there's more fat compared to muscles, so then there's less water. Water content declines over time. In old age, again, is just one of the factors to that is the loss of the muscle, so the loss of water. So when you lose weight, when you lose mass, right? Let's say you're on a diet and you lose mass, and you're like, well, I'm standing on the scale, and you just lost weight, and you're thinking you lost weight. You probably lost muscle, and when you lose muscle, you lose water, right? 1 gram has to be supported by 3 grams, or 1 kilo by 3 kilo. The ratio is 1:3, and there's some other factors as well. So, as I mentioned before, it's better to remember these compartments. The volume is by percentages. So intracellular, within the cell, we have 2/3 of the water, and extracellular, which is the outside of the cell, we have about 1/3 of the total body fluid. That makes whole one, right? 100%. Again, have this visual: blood vessels, interstitial space, and here's a cellular compartment. So the cells, they carry more water compared to both interstitial fluid and intravascular fluid, but interstitial fluid has more water compared to the blood plasma. So that's when we have edema. Usually we have edema in interstitial space, and solutes can affect the water movement from the cell into the interstitial space, or from the blood vessels, or the vice versa. And there's some other extra fluid that we can find in other tissues. Part of the intracellular fluid, lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, the humerus fluid of the eye, synovial fluid within the joints, serous fluid around the soft organs, and gastrointestinal secretion. So that's where else water could be found. So the composition of the body fluids. Water is a universal solvent, right? So many chemical processes happens within the water. Solutes are substances dissolved with water. So this is just a repeat from the previous courses, or from even within this course with Anatomy and Physiology 1. Solutes are classified non-electrolytes and electrolytes. It depends on the solute. Non-electrolytes do not dissociate. Dissociation, let's say that's the sodium chloride, and if you put it into the water solution, it will dissociate into its respective, and will take its respective charges. So that would be a salt. So, but something that non-electrolytes do not dissociate in water, and most of them are organic molecules. This is inorganic molecules. Sodium and chloride organic molecules have carbon, hydrogen. So electrolytes dissociate into water, and they take their respective charges. That's why we call them electrolytes, because now they can conduct electrical current. Ions conduct electrical currents. The electrolytes, ion that has a charge. So these electrolytes, they do have great osmotic power. Intracellular osmotic pressure, meaning we're going here. Intravascular osmotic pressure, meaning we're going inside of the blood vessels. So the greater osmotic power due to solutes. So the concentration of solutes in the cell right now higher compared to concentration in the interstitial space. That's why water flows inside of the cell. Interstitial osmotic pressure, interstitial osmotic power, interstitial osmotic pool, meaning that the water, so meaning that the solutes here within their higher concentration compared what's in cell or what's in blood. So the water would be drawing towards the interstitial space. So, and that's caused by electrolytes, by the solutes. And that leads to greater ability for the fluid to shift from one compartment into another compartment, but we have to maintain this ratio. This 20%, 80% that makes up 20% of extracellular fluid, and there's 40% in intracellular fluid. That's a ratio. And this is the total, the 60% of the body weight. So this would be 2/3, and this is 1/3, and that's the ratio. So here you see the composition of body fluids and electrolytes that are inside of the cell and outside of the cell. I already mentioned that there's a certain electrolytes that like to hang out inside or the outside of the cell. But what does it really mean? You see this arrow? This arrow represents that they constantly in the move, right? Sodium goes inside of the cell, potassium leaves the cell for the action potential, and calcium constantly moving. So the electrolytes are in a constant move. So, and that arrow represents this. So this represents a cell. So this is intracellular fluid, and what's outside is extracellular fluid. You see this extracellular fluid? This is the interstitial space. This is intracellular fluid, and this is the intravascular fluid. So intravascular fluid and interstitial fluid, that's extracellular fluid. So it's basically these elements that outside, that's where by volume there's a higher concentration of these electrolytes. Like sodium, there's more sodium outside of the cell. And that's why I don't have sodium inside of the cell, even though you should know that there's sodium also inside of the cell, but with lesser concentration. So here's the chloride. There's more chloride outside compared to what's inside. There's more calcium outside compared to what's inside. And there's bicarbonate outside compared to what's inside. But please remember, they constantly move because they have to maintain this electron gradient. And there's more potassium inside, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate. So that's, and there's the charges, respective charges. Because again, sodium, let's say, will move down its own concentration gradient. This is the outside, this is inside. So inside there's less sodium, and outside there's more sodium. So that element will move down its own concentration, and potassium will leave because there's more potassium inside of the cell compared to what's outside. So there's more potassium that's going to leave out the cell because of the concentration gradient. And there's also attraction forces, plus to minus, right? So please keep this in mind. Positive is cation and negative is anion. And when you see major, so you can say compared to the level or the amount or the concentration of the electrolyte inside or outside. So what's the major cation in extracellular fluid? That's a sodium. What is the major cation in intracellular fluid? That's potassium. Extracellular fluid, sodium chloride must be balanced. And in intracellular fluid, there's low sodium and low chloride, because the sodium higher here and chloride higher here. But the major cation inside and the major anion that balanced are potassium. So osmotic gradient is the difference in solid concentration. Solid concentration that's separated by the gradient. The gradient is the membrane between two regions, which is inside or outside of the cell. Osmotic and hydrostatic pressure. Osmotic pressure, that's the pull towards the concentration, highest concentration gradient of the solute. And the hydrostatic pressure is the pressure that is applied on the wall of the vessel, of the cell. And the hydrostatic pressure regulate continuous exchange and mixing of fluids, right? Because there's a pressure from outside, pressure from inside, but the solutes, they maintain the movement of water. Water moves freely along the osmotic gradient. Water go down concentration gradient, but towards the higher gradient of the solute. But if we want to maintain the health and equilibrium, all body fluid osmolarity meaning concentration of a solute within the solution, is almost always equal in order to maintain they have that net movement of water. So you wouldn't pull more from one compartment to another compartment. So because one compartment can expand, another compartment can collapse. So this change in solid concentration of any compartment leads to net water flow, right? In extracellular fluid osmolarity, osmolarity, again, concentration of osmoles, concentration of solutes in a compartment. If there's a high concentration in extracellular fluid, then water will leave the cell, right? So there's high concentration in interstitial space and water will leave. So here you have high concentration. Let's say in a cell we have 4 molecules, outside we have a lot. So this would be this. In this example, low extracellular fluid osmolarity. So now in extracellular fluid, in cell we still have 4, but here we have 2. So where the water is going to go inside of the cell, so the water enters the cell. So we already discussed all these concepts, but for some I know this concept are mind-boggling, so I'm repeating this again for this particular acid-base balance lecture. So what's going to happen if there's a leftovers in interstitial space, like proteins, they're being pulled from the blood and need to go get to the cell, but they couldn't. For some reason they got trapped in interstitial space, so lymphatics will pick them up and can return back in circulation. Ions move selectively into or out of the cells, move selectively, so there are channels. So maybe your body does not really need that many, and that can actually prevent movement because it's a semi-permeable membrane, so it decides due to various factors. Nutrients, waste, gases have unidirectional flow, right? So the nutrients and oxygen moves in the tissue, and the waste and carbon dioxide moves out. So here's a blood plasma, blood plasma, interstitial space, and this intracellular space. That's the normal flow. Oxygen and carbon dioxide back, nutrients in, and the water and the ions. You see the arrow goes both directions, so the water goes in both directions due to osmolarity, due to this thing. And osmolarity is the concentration of the solutes in a particular compartment, and the water could be attracted to that. Ions, the same thing, selectively permeable membrane, right? So it can permit or not permit movement. That's within the kidneys. You remember within the kidneys, filtration process, secretion, and reabsorption. And nitrogenous waste, right, from intracellular fluid and end up in the kidneys for elimination. So here's the review on what is filtration, what is osmosis, what is diffusion. Pay attention. Filtration, movement of water and solutes. Filtration, movement of water and solutes, let's say kidneys, from blood with higher pressure to interstitial fluid, low pressure. So filtration going from high pressure to low pressure when there is a pressure. So, and you're filtering through, that's a filtration. Hydrostatic pressure, intravascular, hydrostatic pressure, interstitial fluid. The pressure is applied on the walls of the vessel. Has to be ratio. But you're still going from high pressure to low pressure. From 30 pressure millimeters of mercury to 2, so it's easier. So that's the flow. We're going this direction. From high concentration, more pluses, to low concentration, less pluses, right? From higher pressure to lower pressure. So the filtration is the movement of water and the solids together. Diffusion, going from high to low, similar to filtration from high to low, but the diffusion is the movement of solids in this case, right? Because osmosis would be movement of water. I want to separate this language. So the movement of solids, again, they're also diffusing from high concentration, here's the pluses, to low concentration. And the waste is going back, it's diffusing because it needs to enter this, the vascular system, so we can eliminate that. So it ends up in interstitial fluid, let's say from the cell, right, from intracellular to interstitial and to the intravascular. So also going down its concentration gradient from high concentration to low concentration. So the diffusion is the movement of solids, for example, sodium, glucose, whatever, from high concentration to low concentration. And osmosis, the statement of law of osmosis is the movement of water from low solute concentration to high solute concentration. Movement of water, this is the selectively permeable membrane, water will be attracted towards the highest concentration gradient of a solid. So the hydrostatic pressure is the push force pressure on the walls, and the osmotic pressure is the pull force attraction. So major sources of water intake and output. Whatever we lose, we need to replenish. So in metabolism, let's say that's what we're supposed to drink, 2,500 milliliters you're supposed to drink. So there's a formula. You take 30 to 35 in healthy individuals milliliters of water, and you multiply by kilogram of your body weight. That's a crude estimation. So it's basically, if I'm, let's say hypothetically, I'm a little bit more than that, 70 kilograms, I'm using 70, it's easier to calculate, 70 kilograms, and let's say I multiply by 30. 7 by 3, it's 21. So it's 2,100 of milliliters of water I'm supposed to drink. But like if you're 75, or you can multiply by 35, let's say 35 multiplied by 7. 24, and right. So if I'm 75 kilo, I will multiply. I'm sorry, if I'm 70 kilograms, and I will multiply by 35 instead of 30. So I'm pretty much there. So for healthy individuals, that's what we use on average. So whatever we lose, we're supposed to replenish. All chemical processes happens in the water. So we used water for metabolism, for foods, for beverages, 60%. So that's the average intake per day. We lose water through feces, through sweat, insensible loss of water through the skin that you do not really realize that you're losing. So that's an average about 500 to 700 milliliters. And the urine output, about 1.5 milliliters. So 1.5 milliliters, that's about 1.5 kilos. Say hi to Pluto. Pluto, say meow, 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 meow. The smartest cat ever, because she's always listening to my recordings, to my lectures. Pluto, say meow. Look. So, right. So whatever we take, we need to replenish. These numbers you don't have to memorize, but so the regulation of water intake, osmolarity, is maintained around 300 milliosmoles, concentration of the solutes within the compartment. Raises osmolarity stimulates thirst. Why raises in osmolarity stimulates the thirst? Right? Blood vessels, cell, interstitial space. So more concentration of solutes will be in interstitial space, and there's more water loss from the cellular compartment, and that's why you're thirsty. So the raise of osmolarity leads to a stimulation of the thirst that leads to release of antidiuretic hormone that will prevent water loss, so you want to keep the water. And decrease in osmolarity will inhibit ADH. Why should I keep the water when it's too much? I would rather to release. So with the hypothalamus, we have a asthma receptors. She does this. If I will raise voice, she will leave, but I do not want to. Pluto, please go. Nah, it's a mutual love relationship. Yes, go. I know how to. She's gone. So within the hypothalamus, we have osmoreceptors that detect extracellular fluid osmolarity, right? That's extracellular fluid osmolarity. So when there's a lot of solutes, so we want to prevent water loss from the cell compartments, so antidiuretic hormone would be released, so we can maintain the water. So you want to dilute now, right? So you keep water and you're diluting this solids. So now the ratio maintained, so the water can eventually start shifting inside of the cell. So any increase over 1 to 2% will activate those osmoreceptors. So decreased blood volume or blood pressure will affect those osmoreceptors. Osmoreceptors, so there's the pressure receptors, right? So that regulates the pressure as well. So that stimulates angiotensin 2 or bioreceptors, right? Pressure receptors, bioreceptors. Angiotensin 2, you remember what angiotensin 2 is responsible for. And drinking water inhibits the thirst centers. Influence of antidiuretic hormone. Water reabsorption in collecting ducts is proportional to ADH release. Collecting ducts, right? Here, collecting ducts. Right, so the ADH acts on the collecting ducts to create aquaporins here, so you can return water back in circulation. So the water is about to leave through the collecting duct, to leave the system, but you can reabsorb water back in circulation. Decreased ADH leads to dilute urine because you're not releasing water. So let's say you have a lot of solutes, and just because you're not releasing water, you're keeping water, and that dilutes. ADH leads to concentrated urine. So if you're returning water, back in circulation, now your urine will have less water. And just because it will have less water, we call it concentrated urine. Concentrated urine meaning that it will have more solutes, it will have more concentrates. So our osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus can sense what's going on inside of the extracellular fluid. Is there too much or too little water, or the solid concentration? So, and based on that, they can regulate the release of antidiuretic hormone, so we can reabsorb water or we can release water. So if we release water together with concentrates, with the filtrates, then the urine would be more dilute. But if you will return water back in circulation through through this aquaporins, now the urine will have less water and there would be more concentrated urine. So that's why here you can see decreased ADH. So you're not returning water back in circulation, so you're releasing water through the collecting duct, dilutes urine, and that drops in volume in your system, so you drop pressure as well. So hypotonic hydration, cellular overhydration, or water intoxication. But in this case, it's rapid excess water ingestion, right? For example, so or you either kidneys are keeping water, cannot get rid of that, and you're drinking too much. So the extracellular fluid osmolarity decreases, meaning that in extracellular fluid, in interstitial space, you have a lot of solutes, right? But osmolarity decreases because you're keeping water. So now the water concentration compared to the solute concentration is bigger. So there's a higher concentration of water compared to solid concentration. So that decreases the osmolarity of extracellular fluid. That causes hyponatremia. Why is it hyponatremia? Because sodium likes to be more, right? So sodium likes to hang out outside of the cell. So now it's also diluted. So now ratio water to sodium is different, right? Now it's more water compared to sodium, has to be ratio maintained. So that's a hypotonic hydration. So hypotonic hydration. So remember water's tonicity, concentration of solutes, not in the cell, but in the solution. So hypotonic hydration. This is the cell, and this is an outside of the cell. So hypotonic, low concentration of solutes compared to what's inside. So the water will enter the cell, will go towards the highest concentration gradient of the solids. So let's look at this example right here. This is the hypotonic hydration. Consequences of hypotonic hydration. Water gain. Water gain where? In the cell. So now in this example, the excessive water enters extracellular fluid, and now in extracellular fluid, osmotic pressure falls, right? Because of the dilution. Now there's a high concentration of solutes inside of the cell. Not necessarily sodium, but different types of solutes. So, and the water will enter the cell due to highest concentration gradient of the solids inside. So the water moves into the cell by osmosis from high concentration of water to low concentration of water, also towards the highest concentration gradient of the solutes, and the cell swells, lyses, and dies. That's what the hypotonic hydration. This is a dehydration. So excessive water loss, and in extracellular space, osmotic pressure rises because you lose water here. So now you have high concentration of solids, and the cell loses water to extracellular fluid by osmosis. So the cell will shrink. Just because you're losing water from here, so the water from the cell will leave towards high concentration gradient of the solid that's sitting within the extracellular compartment. So these arrows could be misleading, but this arrows does not represent movement of water. These arrows by the geniuses refers to number 1, then there's number 2, then there's number 3. Here the same thing, number 1, number 2, number 3, but they're misleading, I can completely understand. So here water moves this way, here water moves that way, right? So do not take these arrows as the movement of water. Here's just another example. Look at this. What's the hypothermia? Hyponatremia. Low concentration of sodium in the, let's say, in the intravascularly or inside of the interstitial space. Low sodium concentration. So if there's a low sodium concentration outside, so the water by osmosis will move inside, and that can lead to shift of other electrolytes. So we already discussed aldosterone and angiotensin. Please review this. We already discussed the RAS system. Please review this. The Addison disease. So the Addison disease is just there's no production of aldosterone. So there's no production of aldosterone. So there's a loss of lots of sodium chloride and water into urine. So that can also decrease the blood volume, blood pressure. Let's look at this process. We discuss ANP, natriuretic peptide, or the hormone that acts on all of the systems to decrease blood pressure. But let's look at cardiovascular bioreceptors. So if there's a high blood pressure, we need to drop the blood pressure. So how can we drop the blood pressure? We can remove sodium and we can remove the water from circulation. How can we do this? So we can increase the flow of water and the flow of sodium through the renal system. So here's your glomerulus, here's your efferent arterioles, here's your efferent arterioles. This is a proximal convoluted tubules that will eventually lead to a collecting duct, right? That's collecting duct with aquaporins here. So central nervous system stimulates kidneys to dilate efferent arterioles. Impulses to kidney declines, and that leads to efferent arterioles to dilate. So now they're more dilated. So when they're more dilated, there's more blood flow within the glomerulus. If there's more blood flow, then that speeds up the movement of the sodium and the water, and eventually that leads to release of the water and the sodium from the renal system. So the GFR increases just because the efferent arterioles dilate and there's more flow. So that less time sodium spends and water spends within the renal system, and so there's less absorption of the sodium, so there's more excretion of the sodium. So that increases sodium and water output, and that leads to the drop of the blood pressure. Here's the entire cascade of the reaction. I'm going to put a fat check mark here. So decreased stimulation of the nervous system and the renal system leads to dilation of efferent arterioles, leads to increase of filtration that increases water and sodium loss, right? Because you increase the flow and the blood volume and blood pressure drops. So that way how this ANP can act on all of the steps of the organs that control the increase of blood pressure or keep the blood pressure. Please know this stuff. Review this. We've done this before. Here is hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. Mind-boggling info. So you remember this? Minus 70, that's what we try to maintain within the cell. So that creates the resting membrane potential, and that's what the potassium is very important to maintain resting membrane potential, just because when sodium enters, the cell becomes more positive, right? so it becomes more positive. Now you plus 30, sodium enters. So there's more sodium outside, and there's less potassium also outside. So there's more potassium inside, and there's less sodium inside, right? So they're all positive. So by bringing sodium, that leads to depolarization, right? So you're depolarizing. You're plus 30 now. Now you have to reset the membrane potential. You have to go back to resting membrane potential. And now we're more positive, we're removing positive, so we can become more negative. We can even hyperpolarize, come back to minus, go back to, get back or get down to minus 90. So we can establish resting membrane potential, go back to minus 70, so we can reset membrane potential, so we can generate another impulse, right? Remember all that. So there was a review of the system. But now we're going to look at hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. Here's the cell, same players, minus 70. Now in hyperkalemia you have high potassium outside, when normally we have low potassium outside. In hyperkalemia, just because now there's high potassium outside, where this potassium is going to go? So when you're at plus 30, when you just depolarize membrane, you need to remove potassium out so you can repolarize. But now the concentration changed. In extracellular fluid, you have high potassium. Where this potassium is going to go? It's going to go down its concentration gradient. It's going to go down into the cell. And now you're breathing potassium, similar as you were breathing sodium inside. By breathing sodium inside, you depolarize. Now just because concentration changes due to hyperkalemia, so now you're breathing potassium and sodium, you're depolarizing membrane even further. And that reduces excitability just because you're going over this threshold. That's the hyperkalemia. Causes decrease in resting membrane potential because you have a harder time to repolarize membrane. That's the hyperkalemia. Let's look at another scenario. Cell minus 70, right? Plus 30. Now you have hypokalemia. Now you have low potassium, which is normal, but it's very low, below normalities, and now it looks like there's more potassium out inside of the cell, even though potassium leaves, but now it's going to be more potassium leaving, right, because there's hypokalemia. By removing more potassium, you are naturally, when you're removing potassium, you're repolarizing membrane, but now you're removing more and you will hyperpolarize. So that will lead to non-responsiveness, because when you're getting to the refractory period, hyperpolarization, you cannot generate another impulse. You cannot generate another action potential. So disruption of potassium, either hyper or hypokalemia in heart, for example, can definitely interfere with electrical conduction, and that may lead to death. So hyperkalemia, hypokalemia, hypernatremia, hyponatremia, we're talking about this electrolytes outside of the cell, and they can disrupt the movement of electrolytes through the normal process of diffusion from high to low. Here's high, here's low, obviously you're gonna go there. If there is high and there is low, you're gonna enter. And that can also lead to fluid shift, obviously. And that can also have its own consequences. Potassium also part of the buffering system. Hydrogens and potassium, there's a mutual relationship. You have if one cation leaves, another cation has to enter to replace that. If you have hydrogen going into the cell and you have potassium in there, so that positive will push this positive, and now you will have this hydrogen and potassium would be outside. It basically replaces. Where's the potassium gonna go? Into the blood. So extracellular potassium rises with acidosis. Extracellular potassium levels falls with alkalosis. And that can interfere definitely with activity of excitable cell. So let's look at acidosis and alkalosis. In blood, right, let's say we have high concentration of hydrogens. So they go from high to low and they move into interstitial fluid. From the interstitial fluid, more hydrogen enters and displaces potassium, and potassium leaves, and the potassium diffuses into the blood. And now blood has a high concentration of potassium. So in acidosis, extracellular fluid potassium rises. Why? Because when there's acidosis, there is a high this toxin hydrogen, the proton. So within the acidosis, proton pushes the potassium, and that's why there's a high levels of potassium, right? Where in extracellular fluid. And what is this? That's a hyperkalemia. And that disrupts the normal flow of this electrolytes in the cardiac muscles, right? What we just discussed. So this, the entire thing, this depolarization, this acidosis may cause depolarization, followed by reduced excitability because it's harder to reestablish membrane potential. So with alkalosis, extracellular potassium falls, right? So that's a hypokalemia. So the hypokalemia, you will be moving more potassium. So, but you see how it's all interrelated one with another? And if one leaves, another enters, right? In hyperkalemia, if there's high potassium, why is it high potassium? Just because that's acidosis, hydrogen enters, so it pushes out potassium. Now there's more potassium, and this potassium tries to go back, and that leads to depolarization. So keep this flow in mind, play around with that so you can understand it more. Instead of memorizing, it's impossible to memorize this thing, because with every change of factors or variables, it would be hard to answer a particular question. So it's better to understand this. So the most important factor affecting potassium secretion, it's concentration in extracellular fluid. So that concentration in extracellular fluid leads to movement of the potassium within the system. High potassium diet leads to increased potassium content in extracellular fluid. Where do we get potassium? Nuts, seeds, grains. So it's basically legumes, nuts, seeds, and grains. But the body tries to maintain that and get rid of that. Potassium entry into the principal cells. The principal cells, if you remember, they maintain the pressure, like sodium chloride and potassium. Principal cells with the convoluted tubules. So leads to increased potassium secretion to maintain the balance. Low potassium diet or accelerated potassium loss reduces its secretion, because you need to keep it at least something so you can maintain the balance between sodium. So if there's low potassium, there is a high sodium. Or there's high potassium, there's a low sodium. And there's also chloride. So yeah, I did not come up with this stuff. Aldosterone stimulates potassium secretions and sodium reabsorption, right? You keep sodium, you release potassium to the principal cells. So the principal cells within convoluted tubules, so that's where, remember in the renal system, revisit principal cells and intercalated cells. Adrenal cortical cells are directly sensitive to potassium. with the adrenal glands, with the cortex, right? So because from the cortex we release what? Aldosterone. With the medulla we release norepinephrine. So the corticosteroid hormones. So adrenal glands would be very sensitive to potassium because aldosterone can manipulate sodium and potassium. Increased potassium in adrenal cortex causes the release of aldosterone and increase of potassium secretion. Oh, there's potassium, aldosterone gets in circulation, releases the potassium, keeps the sodium. Why? Again, because of this mechanism, right? So you want to, and because of this, you want to maintain depolarization and proper repolarization, not hyperpolarization, because you cannot generate another another action potential. So the potassium is the main electrolyte that's responsible for the resting membrane potential. That all ties to this stuff. So in the absence of aldosterone, hyperkalemia is swift, right? Hyperkalemia, high potassium, with the absence of aldosterone, because aldosterone would secrete potassium, would get rid of potassium, right? But now there's a hyperkalemia, so there's more potassium, there's more potassium entering the cell, going down concentration gradient, and that leads to more depolarization, hyperkalemia. But if a person has adrenocortical tumor that pumps out tremendous amount of aldosterone, now you have high aldosterone, so you remove potassium, now you have low potassium. Low potassium leads to hyperpolarization, right? Because you have low potassium here, and now it looks like you have more potassium inside. It leaves the cell, and when the potassium leaves the cell, that repolarizes membrane, but now it's hyperpolarizes because the potassium gets out, and just because extracellular potassium is low here, regardless of this potassium leaving, it's still low here, so that leads to hyperpolarization, and that can lead to paralysis, right? Because you cannot generate another action potential. Chloride shift, right? So let's say we lose chloride. Now we have to replace this chloride. So the chloride from the blood will get into the interstitial space. From interstitial space, it will enter into the stomach, right? Let's say through vomiting, we're losing chloride. But now we have to replace that anion, and from the red blood cells, we can pull bicarbonate from the red blood cells into the blood vessels to replace that. So the movement, like hydrogen pushes the potassium out, same thing is here. So we have to replace negatives, or we have to replace positives in order to maintain the homeostasis. Low serum chloride leads to high serum bicarbonate. What is bicarbonate? The bicarbonate likes to attach hydrogen, and that will become carbonic acid. So chloride and bicarbonate exchange places because they're both negatively charged. So there are multiple mechanisms to maintain acid-base balance. Chemical buffer system, respiratory center system, and the renal mechanism. So we're going to look at this too, right? We're going to look at this one and then this one. And you already know that because we discussed this before. So let's look at this thing. Looks complicated, but it's straightforward. So cells releases hydrogens and producing carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. So now water and carbon dioxide combine together and you have the carbonic acid. Then you can also take hydrogen and attach to bicarbonate, and you will also have a carbonic acid here. So the carbonic acid through the kidney releases the hydrogen, and now you have bicarbonate and hydrogen is being released through the renal system. Here's another view, right? Water and the carbon dioxide. Again, you have carbonic acid. But now you can bring this into the lungs, and now you break down the carbonic acid into the carbon dioxide and water. You exhale carbon dioxide, and you can evaporate water, you can keep water. So it's basically this mechanism, this carbonic acid, hydrogens together with bicarbonate, you have this. Or you combine this, you have that. You break down carbonic acid, you have water and carbon dioxide. You break down carbonic acid, you have hydrogens, and you have bicarbonate. So in the chemical buffering system, we have strong acids, weak acids, strong bases, weak bases. Strong acids, it means that the acid, hydrochloric acid, will completely dissociate in water. Completely. That could be a problem. Weak acid not completely dissociates like carbonic acid. So that's less problematic. So you will not have this very huge shifts, right? From the 7 to the right or from the 7 to the left, right? If you have a strong acid, then there's a lot of hydrogens. If there is weak acid, and then you can shift hypothetically from 7 all the way down. Exaggerating, right? But the same thing with strong bases, right? So why do you want to be here? You want to be somewhere here. So that's why this particular molecule is weak acid and there's weak bases. So the shifts are small to the left and to the right. So it's easier to bring back to the neutral state. So this bicarbonate buffer system, you already know that because this formula, right? So basically all that. Here's just an extra inclusion is the sodium. Sodium bicarbonate. There's a bicarbonate or the sodium bicarbonate. So the sodium bicarbonate, you're just making sodium chloride. But this buffering system is pretty much this one. Let's look at this respiratory and renal system. So like those physiological buffering system, that's what we're mostly gonna concentrate on. So this is on the renal side, this is on the respiratory side. To get rid of carbon dioxide, right? So we can combine carbon dioxide with water. Here's the carbonic acid, and that gets into the lungs, and you release carbon dioxide. Or you're producing a lot of hydrogens through the cellular respiration, you become a carbonic acid, and you release hydrogens through the carbon dioxide, right? Because this is same as this. This is the same as this. It's pretty simple. So with partial carbon dioxide in blood, hypercapnia rises, that activates medullary receptors, respiratory receptors in the medulla oblongata. That increases respiratory rate and depth, so you can get rid of. So that leads to hyper ventilation, so that can get rid of faster carbon dioxide, but that can lead to alkalosis, but we want to maintain this homeostasis. But increase in the protons, which is the acidosis, carbon dioxide hypercapnia, and increase of protons is acidosis. That activates peripheral chemoreceptors in the peripheral system. That also will cause the respiratory rate increase and the depths. To get rid of this, again, if we're getting rid of this through the respiratory system, we're getting rid of this hydrogen that have been combined with a bicarbonate that became a carbonic acid, and we releasing hydrogens via carbon dioxide. Both cause more carbon dioxide, hydrogen and partial carbon dioxide, this one or this one, more cause, both of them cause more of carbon dioxide removed, right? Because either you remove carbon dioxide this way, or you remove carbon dioxide by bonding hydrogens with bicarbonate, becoming carbonic acid, and then releasing hydrogen, carbon dioxide, shifting to the left. I'm constantly repeating the same concepts over and over again. So that reaction is pushed to the left, which reduces hydrogen concentration. So that's how the system is very versatile. Hypoventilation, hyperventilation. Hypoventilation, you're keeping on toxins. Hyperventilation, you're releasing them. So in hyperventilation, you are in alkaline state. In hypoventilation, you are in acidosis, right? We discussed this before, review this. And again, it's all done through here. So renal system can compensate for pulmonary system, and pulmonary system can compensate for the renal system if one is not functioning. This one is more effective, but it takes longer period of time, and this is less effective, but it takes pretty short period of time to get rid of toxins. So this is basically explain the entire thing. But here that we did not discuss before, the enzyme carbonic anhydrase that does this conversion from here to here, right, to carbonic acid. So this, everything that I just discussed is written here. Please know this stuff. So you can look at this structure. This is the red blood cell, hemoglobin molecule. There's nothing new here. So let's say in systemic capillaries, bicarbonate diffuses from red blood cells into plasma, and chloride moves into red blood cells from plasma, shifting. So let's say carbon dioxide from the tissue enters and been loaded in the red blood cell to be removed. So the carbon dioxide within the cells would be combined with water, and that is faster compared to the renal system. So now you have this carbonic acid, and now this carbonic acid would be broken down into bicarbonate and hydrogens. The system is fast, but you can also remove carbon dioxide. Instead of being loaded on the red blood cell, you can just go directly flow through the plasma. So through the plasma, the same thing happens. You're combining same players, and you're getting that carbonic acid. And now also you have bicarbonate and hydrogen that can also be eliminated, binds with plasma protein, and could be removed from the body. Here, when the bicarbonate leaves, it has to be replaced with chloride. Negative has to be replaced with negative. So there's more of one would be leaving and less of another would be entering. But it doesn't matter, it's a chloride shift in via transport proteins. And there's also some small percentage of carbon dioxide just dissolved in plasma without being added to anything. When it dissolves in plasma, we will use it for carboxylative reactions. We need carbon, we need oxygen, right? So it would be used for some other processes. And this shows in pulmonary what happens in pulmonary capillaries. So this is the alveoli. You can normally, right, there's the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in plasma can enter the alveoli. We can get rid of that. So then this is the slow and this is the fast system. They're very similar. So you have this hydrogen, you have this bicarbonate, you have this carbonic acid now because you put them together. So, and then you can remove carbon dioxide and you can keep water in the solution, and you can evaporate so that enters the alveoli or alveolus one. So the same thing, the red blood cell can transport this toxin, the hydrogens, the proton, again binds with bicarbonate, you have a carbonic acid, but the system is faster compared to this system, and it also will be removed from the system. So it's about 10% of carbon dioxide dissolved in plasma, basically lost. Then there's about 20% combined with hemoglobin. And there is a 70% that we discussed combined with bicarbonate right here, and it's been eliminated. So we didn't really look at the hemoglobin. So the carbon dioxide binds with hemoglobin, now it becomes carboaminohemoglobin, and then it can also be removed. So, but we concentrate on this too, that what is dissolved within the plasma and what is combined with bicarbonate. So basically, this is the entire lecture on acid base. There's a few things that we didn't discuss, but I think this is enough for about 2 weeks of looking at this stuff and making sure and understanding when there's a high concentration, lower concentration in cell or in extracellular fluid, and the movement of this electrolytes in and out. For some of you it would be mind-boggling, but for some of you it would be pretty straightforward. Thank you very much. Have a great day.